This is Grandmaster Daniel Naroditsky. We are watching the world champion Magnus Carlsen taking on Grandmaster Sanan Sjugirov at the 2021 FIDE World Rapid and Blitz. We can see the world champion adjusting his pieces meticulously, getting ready. Let's see what opening we will see. Magnus, of course, can play absolutely anything. D4, E4. He's experimented with almost every normal move, and here he plays E4, mainline stuff. E4, E5. Will we see a Ruy Lopez? Yes, we will. Magnus known as one of the leading experts, and Sanan trying to get the Berlin. Magnus saying, no, you're not taking that pawn on E4. The anti-Berlin with D3, bishop C6, DC. That is a very typical structure, and this particular line has been played extensively in top-level chess in the last decade or so. Now, the E5 pawn needs to be defended by Sanan. He can go bishop G4 and pin the knight, or he can defend it directly with knight D7 or queen E7. Lots of possible moves here. A lot of innovation going on in this line. Sanan taking the early think here, and he does go for the conventional knight D7. Now, that blocks the light-squared bishop, and Magnus immediately trying to exploit that, going pawn C3. Is he preparing to expand in the center with D4? That's, I think, less common than playing knight C3, with a very interesting idea. It gives Sanan a little bit pause. He castles, and Magnus follows through with D4. Bishop drops back to D6, keeping E5 protected. Magnus gets his bishop out to G5, attacking the queen. Now there's another choice. Does black play F6 or queen E8? Magnus forcing Sanan into a lot of decisions early on in this game. That is what he does best. The position looking pretty quiet here. No attacking chances for either side. I think a lot of the action is going to go on in the center. Rook E1 defending the E4 pawn, X-raying the queen. And Sanan, he has to find a way to get that light-squared bishop out of the gate. I don't think he's going to be able to play this middle game if he doesn't develop that bishop. But if he moves his knight off of D7, then that relinquishes the defense on the E5 pawn. So maybe he should play F6, and then he'll be able to move his knight to B6 and get his light-squared bishop out. But the move F6, as Ben Feingold will tell us, obviously weakens the king side. He goes H6, so he does chase the bishop away. How is he going to follow up? Bishop H4. Okay. And he goes for C5, so he challenges White's pawn on D4. He wants to get Magnus to push that D pawn up to D5. That also takes the pressure off of the E5 pawn, and that will then allow him to finally move that knight off of D7, get the bishop out. Magnus, this is a big moment. Does Magnus go D5? He can also take the pawn on E5, or he can ignore. He can develop his own knight on B1 because White hasn't finished his development either. Magnus taking his blazer off there, dropping the bishop back to G3. He responds by applying even more pressure to the E5 pawn. We're probably going to see some form of a trade in the next couple of moves. These players are keeping the tension, both of them trying to trade on their own terms. Now, is Sjugirov going to take on D4, and if so, with which pawn? I think taking with the C pawn and then following up by something like queen E7 looks reasonable. That queen on E8 is a little bit passive, and it's sandwiching the rook on F8. Black's position looking just a tiny bit uncomfortable here. This is the kind of position that Magnus loves. He's got a tiny advantage. It's quiet. There's no attacking chances for Black, and he does go for queen E7. Sanan could follow up with rook D8 and try to X-ray White's queen. Now, are we going to see Magnus taking on E5 here? And if so, how many times? He can take two minor pieces on E5, and then we're going to see a mass trade. But it's more in Magnus' style usually to keep the tension. So will he go knight B1 to D2, or will he try to develop the knight to the side with knight A3? That looks a little less likely. That's not really up Magnus' alley. He's taking the first really significant think of the game for White. And maybe not too comfortable with the way that this is unfolding. Maybe Magnus isn't seeing exactly how he can cause more discomfort for Black in the center. I like knight B to D2, and then trying to get that knight to C4, trying to get Black to be the one to take on D4, and maybe even opening up the E4 pawn to advance to E5. That could be a dangerous idea if Black plays E takes D4. So he's probably going to play C takes D4. Magnus taking a pretty long time here. There's a lot to think about. A big decision to be made for White here. This will really define the course of the game. Tons of stuff going on in the center. Tons of potential trades. Let's see what Magnus chooses, and he advances the pawn to D5. I didn't really expect that. What an interesting decision. Now, that leaves the D6 bishop very, very passive, but it takes the pressure off of E5. So will Sjugirov take this opportunity and get his knight to F6 or B6 and then try to get his bishop out to D7 or G4? Or will he go full-on ambitious with F5? He goes rook to E8. So he adds yet another defender on E5, but I think the primary idea of this move is actually to get the D7 knight over to F8 and then around to G6. That's a very typical classic maneuver for both sides in Ruy Lopez and Italian positions. A4, A5 played, neither side wanting to give up a lot of space, and Magnus does go knight A3, so he's carved out a little pathway for himself either to C4 or to B5. There goes knight F8. and the other knight dropping back to d2. So is Magnus trying to get one knight to c4 and the other knight to b5? What an interesting arrangement of knights as he transitions his pressure more to the queen side. He goes knight dc4, the other knight definitely heading toward b5. Or could it be going around to c2 and e3? That seems a little bit cumbersome. And now for black, Sanan could try to get things going on the king side. He could play f5, he could get his queen into g5 and try to prepare h5, h4. White's king isn't surrounded by all that many pieces now that the knights have left. So let's see if black tries to exploit this opportunity and get stuff going on that king side. No b6. Sanan choosing a more solid option, solidifying his queenside pawns, and Magnus following through on his maneuver with knight b5. Now he threatens to win a pawn here. He threatens to take the bishop with a b knight and then take the b pawn with the c knight. That's a mouthful. So rook b8 here would make a lot of sense to defend that b6 pawn. Maybe there's a more tactical way to do it. Maybe bishop a6 would work because that knight on b6 could end up getting trapped. No, Sanan going rook b8 and even knight a7 has to be considered by Magnus here, trying to reroute that knight in a rather creative maneuver to c6. Obviously, that would threaten a fork, and it would essentially force black to play bishop d7. That could be an interesting trade. Magnus, once again, taking his time. Can he find a way to improve his position? Now the center has gotten locked up. The position is closed down, and this is a lot more of a maneuvering struggle. Who can place their pieces better? Because eventually the center is going to open up where the flank is, and there we go. b4 by Magnus as he tries to explode the queen side. C takes b4. Now he's probably going to take the bishop and then recapture on b4 and try to create as many weaknesses as possible on black's queen side. I love that move. Now he's probably thinking about which knight to take the bishop with because he can't take the pawn immediately. That would drop the pawn. He plays knight c takes d6. Now he's going to play cb. And that's a temporary pawn sacrifice. If Sjugirov takes on b4, Magnus is going to win that pawn. He's not going to have any trouble with that. And he's going to have the c-file for his rooks. He's going to try to infiltrate with rook c1 and maybe rook c7. So Sjugirov has to get his bishop out, and he does. But now his d6 pawn is hanging, so he might have to take the knight, and he does that as well. Queen takes b5. Magnus has a lot of squares on the queen side that he could try to stick a rook on. Rook c6 now, a big threat. So Sjugirov has to consider rook c5, but then Magnus will take, and the b8 rook is going to be hanging. So queen comes back to d8, preparing to go knight e7. Great move by Sjugirov. That's a nice defensive idea. Rook c6 will now be met with knight g6 to e7, getting that rook off of c6. And if Magnus plays a5 at any moment, then the entire queen side is going to liquidate. So Sanan has one pawn that he has to keep protected at all costs. That b6 pawn, he has to make sure that he keeps it protected, or Magnus is going to have a passer on a4. We have a trade of rooks. Now black is a rook on the c-file. Magnus creating some luft with h3. Sjugirov sending his rook back to the a-file, staring down the a4 pawn. Now, queen takes b6 here would lead to a mass exchange. Magnus playing f3 and preparing to drop his bishop down to f2 and adding pressure on the b6 pawn. Sjugirov has his back against the wall here all of a sudden, but for now, he's got all of the key squares protected. Now, taking on b6 here wouldn't be very effective, or so I thought. No, Magnus does take on b6. Oh, the idea is that if Sjugirov takes now with the queen, then the d6 pawn is going to be weak, and he's going to lose a pawn. So he's currently down a pawn. He seeks counterplay with queen c2. Magnus cannot take on d6 because his rook will be hanging. He moves his rook to a1. Now Sjugirov can take on a4, but he doesn't. He goes queen c3. Time pressure is approaching. Magnus's rook is attacked. Now Magnus has a very weak king, so there's a lot of chances to deliver perpetual check, even if Sjugirov remains down a pawn. Magnus drops his queen back to b2, protecting the rook. King h7, king h2, both sides improving their king, but Sjugirov wins back the pawn, and this should be a draw. The only thing black has to be very careful about is that d6 pawn. That's a very, very weak pawn, and Sjugirov has to keep it protected, but he does, and I don't see a way for Magnus to keep attacking it. The queen is protecting it, the queen is attacking it, but h5 by Sjugirov, that was a very compromising move. He's weakened his pawn, and now king h6, that king could get checkmated. Check on h8, king g6, Magnus going queen f8, poking and prodding, trying to get Sjugirov in more time pressure, queen b4, but how does Magnus make progress? He knows how to squeeze water from a stone. Queen e8, king h6. We've seen that before. Will there be a repetition and a draw? Queen c8. Is Magnus going to f5? Sjugirov getting nervous here. He's down to seconds on his clock. Queen d2. He's trying to force perpetual. He's trying to go queen f4. Magnus doesn't allow it. Queen e3. Now, will Magnus go g4 and threaten mate? No, king h3. Queen back to c1. Now, Sjugirov has the same threat. King h2. They're repeating moves. Magnus not making progress. Back goes the queen to c8. Queen f4, king h3. But now Sjugirov is out of checks. And now, how does the queen get back to defend the d6 pawn? Magnus attacks it. Queen b4. He's got to defend it. He defends it again. We've seen this position a couple of times now. And g4 by Magnus. One last attempt. Takes king takes g4. Black's king is almost cornered. Sjugirov gets it back to h7 just in time. Can Magnus advance his own king to f5 and try to use his king to attack the weakness? Queen h5 check, king g8. He's probably going to repeat once. No, king f5. There it goes. And Magnus has a pathway to e6. And if Sjugirov loses the d6 pawn, then he's probably going to lose the game. And Magnus has somehow gotten his king to e6. And now he's won the pawn. But can he avoid the perpetual? Queen d8. Sjugirov is going to try to corner this king and hunt it down with a series of unending checks. Magnus, though, he's escaping. He's getting it back to c4, back to c3. He's gotten it toward his own camp. It's heading to d2. And Magnus is going to get his king all the way around to the king side. I think he's going to be able to escape the checks here. As Sjugirov, he's not sure which check to give. Queen b4, king e2. There goes Magnus's king. It's made it all the way back to f1. What an incredible king journey. Only Magnus can do this. King g2. He's going to go to h3. Sjugirov is out of checks. Sjugirov is out of checks. Now Magnus should be able to squeeze a win out of this. But Sjugirov preparing to give a series of other checks with queen h1. Magnus going queen f5, opening up a retreat square, an h5 for his king. Now he gives a check to Sjugirov. Queen g4, king f7. Queen h1 check is a threat, which Magnus parries with queen g2. Now his king is safe, but can he get his d-pawn moving? How does Magnus get that d-pawn in motion? It's currently being stopped. h5, what an amazing move. Preparing queen g6 check. That would be a devastating check. Sjugirov on alert, dropping his king back. Here goes Magnus's king again. It hasn't had enough. Oh, and Sjugirov blunders his queen. Then Sjugirov blunders his queen. What an incredible display by Magnus Carlsen to produce chances. Wow. If you like this video, make sure to click the link on the playlist for more such videos. Thank you for watching.